Before you watch this video, go watch part 1 and 2. I had posted it about 2 years ago, and I had never followed up with part 3. So here's part 3. We last left off on me getting yelled at by the prisoners, and it was like the part of the Scared Straight that you usually see on TV. They basically yelled at us and called us out for what we had did and why we were there, and then they talked about how horrible it was to be in prison. And eventually the guards decided that we had run out of time or whatever, and it was like 5 p.m, so we were headed back to the bus. And we're headed back to the base camp where we had slept the night before. It was basically this fenced-in prison yard. I guess the prisoners weren't using it at the time. I think it was actually an exercise yard for the correctional officers or something. But we head back to the base camp and we eat dinner. We had the soup and crackers again, and this dinner was very silent. Nobody said a word. And eventually dinner ends and everybody lines up to go to the bathroom. And the bathroom was this little outhouse wooden structure with a bucket in it. The camp counselors really tried to make this program as horrible as possible. You couldn't just go to the bathroom whenever you wanted, you couldn't eat whenever you wanted, and you had to sleep when they wanted you to. And after everyone had gone to the bathroom, we had to go to sleep. And there's these tiny one-person tents, and all the kids had them. I go into mine, I go into the sleeping bag, and I start falling asleep. I remember it was like 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sleeping bag was damp, and I remember the first couple of nights it was hard to fall asleep, but I was so tired on the third night I had just fallen asleep. And the next morning, I'm awoken by the trumpets. And they were like the military trumpets that you hear in the movies. And I remember this was a cold, quiet, foggy morning, and all of the drill sergeants were super serious that day. We had done some brutal exercises the second we had woken up, and then we were headed to the outhouses. Then we had breakfast, and it was a quiet breakfast. After all the craziness in part 1 and 2, nobody said a word about anything, and everybody ate the gross food without complaining. We finish up breakfast, and then they tell us to follow them, and they opened the gate, and they were leading us out onto the road, and we were kind of walking on the side of it, and we had walked quite a ways, and eventually we walked to this war memorial. It was cold, and the sun was still rising, and this war memorial had a fancy lake behind it. It was kind of pretty, but the big stone structures really made it feel like it was a part of the Hunger Games or something. And they had us do more exercises, and then we listened to the camp counselors talk about their life and why they wanted to volunteer for this Scared Straight program. Then we do the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, and on our way back into the fenced-in prison yard base camp place, we start picking up trash on the side of the road. And there was a couple camp counselors behind us as well to make sure that we didn't leave a single piece of trash behind. We literally picked up every single piece of trash on that road. Every cigarette butt, every little piece of paper that was broken apart by the rain. They made sure we left nothing. Eventually we get back to the base camp and we eat lunch. And after lunch the parents come. And for about an hour the kids and the parents and the camp counselors are in the cafeteria tent area. And they're making everybody talk to the parents about what they had learned. And I guess they decided that I didn't learn enough. And while they were talking to my mom, they had me moving firewood and moving this big huge pile of dirt that was like the size of a truck. My mom was still there, and all the kids and the parents didn't go home yet. They were doing some activities. I wanted to go home, and I thought that if I had moved all the firewood and moved the entire pile of dirt, that they would let me go home. But that was simply not the case. I had moved all the firewood and shoveled a big portion of the dirt. And my mom gets done talking to the camp counselors, and she walks over with them, and they tell me how basically I'm not going to be able to go home at that time like the rest of the kids. And I was going to see my mom around 6 p.m. And I remember crying so much, and they still had me digging the pile of dirt, and I watched my mom walk off and get in her car and leave. And shortly after, all of the parents and the kids had left. And about 20 minutes later, they load me and this other girl up in this van. And one of the camp counselor people tell us that we're headed to the farm. And I was a little scared. I thought that we were going to have to shovel cow poop or do something really gross and horrible. Throughout the Scared Straight experience, the camp counselors had mentioned the farm a few times, and they made it seem really bad. This van ride was about 2 hours, and it was me, 2 of the camp counselors, and this other girl. And the only real conversation I had with anyone during this Scared Straight program was this girl. And she started talking to me, and she started asking these questions that made me realize that she was insane, and she probably belonged in the Scared Straight program. We drive for a little longer, and eventually we arrive at the farm. And they had us wash in the van. And we did a crazy detail. Like, people pay good money to have details like the ones we did. We had really cleaned it out, and we had vacuumed it and cleaned out the cup holders and cleaned under the seats and the wheels and just everything. And next they had us sweeping the patio and vacuuming inside. This farm was a place made for really bad kids. Like, if you got sent here, it was like a sleepaway thing. And they just sent me for a few hours to scare me, but they had a kitchen and a living room, and they had a couple of bedrooms with like 4 bunk beds in there. I get done cleaning for the day, and I made sure that these rooms were spotless, and the camp counselors check, and they said that everything was good. So we load up in the van, and we leave the farm. This time we weren't headed to the base camp. We were headed to a church. And that's where my mom was. That's where the rest of the parents and the kids were. And for the first part of it, the parents and the children were in separate rooms. And they had us doing this team building exercise type thing. I vaguely remember it, but they would give us a situation and they would pick people around the room to try to say how they would solve it. And a lot of these kids really did need the Scared Straight program. It definitely scared me, to say the least, but I wasn't as bad as some of the other kids. Some of the kids there were 14 years old and they were sneaking out of their house to have sex, and there was this 15-year-old and he was selling weed, and I was just there because I just like skipping school and playing my video games. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of today's story. I hope you guys did enjoy. Follow me on Instagram, dankity_spankity, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.